Welcome back, everyone. This is the fourth of our 6 dialogues on nature-based solution. This one reflects the final of our 4 guiding principles about the critical importance of biodiversity for good nature-based solutions. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome our wonderful moderator for this session and great colleague, Valerie Capos. Valerie is head of the Climate Change and Biodiversity Programme of the UN Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Centre. The group's work focuses on the impacts of biodiversity in ecosystem services of climate change and related policies, and the role of biodiversity in ecosystems in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Particular areas of focus are tools for supporting practitioners in planning and implementing effective ecosystem-based adaptation, identifying barriers to and enablers for scaling up nature-based solutions for adaptation, including for the GCA, the Global Commission on Adaptation, and multiple benefits from and environmental and social safeguards for REDD+. Before joining UNEP WCMC, Valerie spent over 15 years doing field research in tropical ecology in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over to you, Val.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the session on biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Consistently through the sessions of this excellent event, we've been hearing and seeing an emphasis on nature-based solutions and their role in solving societal challenges, and most recently, very much a focus on what NbS do for people, which is so critical. And we've mostly seen a focus on nature-based solutions for addressing climate issues, although we heard from Stuart earlier that the definition of nature-based solutions is much broader than that. And we could be addressing any number of societal challenges. We've also seen a lot of emphasis on co-benefits as a major part of the argument for and the value of nature-based solutions. And high up on that list is contributions to biodiversity conservation. Now, as never before, we have a window of opportunity when the world seems at last to see and have in focus the linked nature of the crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And most excitingly, nature-based solutions provides one lens through which there's a wider perception of the linked nature of the solutions to those crises, or at least some of those solutions. But what we'd like to address in this session is what really is the role of biodiversity in nature-based solutions for climate and beyond. What is needed to make sure that nature-based solutions deliver biodiversity benefit? Are they automatic? And does addressing biodiversity explicitly in nature-based solutions increase the effectiveness of those solutions for addressing societal challenges? And how do we know actually what benefits nature-based solutions are achieving? We've got an excellent set of speakers this afternoon who will address variations on those themes. First up, we have Robin Chasden, who will concentrate our minds on the importance of diversity for restoring resilient landscapes. Robin is from the wonderfully named University of the Sunshine Coast. I wish I'd been to that university. Next up, we will have Chris Kettle from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and a number of other institutions, who will be talking to us about the role of tree diversity in nature-based solutions, specifically focused on mitigation of climate change. After that, Red Harrison will bring us back to agricultural landscapes, which we heard about yesterday in the mitigation discussions and how important they are. And he'll talk to us about measuring biodiversity in those contexts. Janice Singh from the Wildlife Conservation Society will then help us focus on the importance of ecological integrity as a key criterion for nature-based solutions. And finally, Manuel Pulgar-Vidal will bring us back to that point I raised about linked agendas between the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity as potential forces for mainstreaming NbS. So welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to some really good discussions. We'll come back to questions at the end, but let's work through our speakers one by one now, starting with Robin.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's been a joy planning this event. Today I'm going to be talking about the importance of biodiversity for restoring resilient ecosystems, and particularly what does it mean to build a resilient landscape, and why does biodiversity matter? And first I want to define what we mean by biological diversity, and it has four main components, as you see here. Species diversity, meaning the number and the abundance of species within and across areas. This includes local or point diversity, as well as the turnover of species across areas. Genetic diversity, meaning the distribution of genetic variation within species, and also the evolutionary history and origins of species within ecosystems. Functional diversity, which refers to how species utilize resources and how they function within the ecosystem and landscape. This also includes ecological interactions like predation, herbivory, pollination, and seed dispersal. And fourth, ecological diversity, which refers to the variety of distinct terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and habitats within a given area. But when we're talking about landscapes where people live and work, we also need to include human diversity, which has sort of been left out of biodiversity. I'd like to bring it back in this discussion. Human diversity refers to the social, cultural, and ethnic diversity and ways of knowing and experiencing the world. This diversity determines the capacity to manage ecosystems and landscapes in ways that sustain the other four components of diversity. So in summary, biodiversity includes all of the ways that living things vary, and that includes humans. So what does resilience mean? This term is used very widely and often it's not defined. So here I'm using this definition that resilience is a property of a complex adaptive system, such as a socio-ecological system, which a landscape is a good representation of. Resilience is the ability of a system to resist, recover from, or adapt to the effects of a shock or a more incremental change. And there are three general paths toward resilience, depending on the intensity and type of disturbance. First, there is the absorbing or seeming resistance to change through various coping mechanisms that we see. And this leads to persistence and stability. But adaptation can also happen. That is incremental adjustment through adaptive capacity. This leads to an incremental change and adaptation that improves the performance or the functioning of the system. The third is the capacity to undergo transformation and reorganization of the system. That means the system components may still be there, but they need to be reorganized and rebuilt in order to ultimately return the system to something similar to its pre-disturbance state. So an example of transformation would be after a very major disturbance that essentially wiped out an ecosystem, and it gradually rebuilds itself over time through succession, through a series of transformational stages. Each of the five components of biodiversity that I just described contribute in different ways to resilience at the landscape scale. And how are these components organized in space in different ways, and how do they interact to influence the recovery of functions and diversity within a landscape? Well, from our knowledge of complex adaptive systems, we can identify at least 6 features of resilient landscapes that are very important to keep in mind as we go about thinking about how can we restore at this scale. And first, that is to maintain the spatial heterogeneity and diverse land uses and habitats within a landscape. Second is to keep the memory of what belongs in that landscape alive by protecting habitat fragments or fragments of trees or different kinds of vegetation, so that there will be the potential for future transformation, future reorganization and recovery. Third is to allow ecosystems to self-organize as much as possible in their own recovery. within this landscape context. Fourth is that we need to balance the redundancy of functions within the ecosystem with the diversity of functions. So we need to have more than one group of organisms or more than one ecosystem that's performing particular functions. Fifth, we need to think about our interventions for restoration in a way that is very adapted to the local social and ecological conditions. This will increase the adaptive capacity of that landscape. And finally, we need to realize that resilient systems are flexible, but there is a lot of uncertainty that goes along with flexibility. And we need to learn to embrace uncertainty and learn how to manage risks and view uncertainty as our friend and not our enemy. So in conclusion, resilient landscapes, restoring them is about ensuring the capacity to recover functions, interactions, species, and ecosystems that were lost or heavily damaged and that can withstand future shocks or disturbances. This requires the collaboration of all living things. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robin. And that's a really, really helpful reminder about all of the dimensions we need to be thinking about in this. Biodiversity is complicated at the best of times. But when you start putting climate in there and other forms of change, it gets even more exciting. Right, next up, we have Chris Kettle from the Alliance for Biodiversity. Chris, are you ready to roll to talk to us about tree diversity and mitigation? Chris?
Yes, sorry, hello. 1 second. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, hello? It's fine, Chris.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be able to talk to you this afternoon. I specifically want to talk about the role of tree biodiversity in nature-based solutions for mitigating climate change. And this is a topic that's very close to my heart and the work that we do within the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Centre for Tropical Agriculture, where we really deliver research-based solutions using agricultural biodiversity for sustainability to improve lives and improve the situation on our planet. I'm just gonna, so I think it really doesn't require me to re-emphasize this point that we're all acutely aware of the fact that we are facing some extreme crises at the moment, and the climate crisis was last year the most explicit one, well, presented by Greta Thunberg, but we also are increasingly aware of health crises, particularly with the recent COVID pandemic. But we're also increasingly aware, as Val nicely illustrated in the introduction, the role of biodiversity in mitigating these situations through nature-based solutions. And I would like to postulate that tree biodiversity has a fundamental role across all of these different crises, including the role of improving diet and health through more carbon neutral agricultural practices. And so to address climate mitigation, we need to really be embracing all of the other multiple benefits that trees can deliver in the context of climate mitigation. I illustrate this point if we want to ensure nature-based solutions support biodiversity, then we really need to be using it. Of course, using it sustainably, but in the context of trees, this example of a castanero from the Madre de Dios in Peru, who is planting Brazil nut trees, which are one of the most valuable non-timber forest products, recognizes not only the benefits to him, but the importance of investing in the benefits to his future generations through planting these species. Of course, species alone is not enough, and as Robin mentioned in her presentation, biodiversity and tree biodiversity not only is species diversity, but it's genetic diversity. And I want to take a few moments just to reflect on this, because I think it's a fundamental part of ensuring that nature-based solutions are resilient to the changing environments. Particularly, we recognize that tree genetic resources enable tree species to adapt to future environmental change. They also confer resistance to pest and disease. But as Robin illustrated, that this genetic diversity, and particularly of trees as foundational species, are fundamental to the resilience of ecological systems and landscapes. And I think it's worth emphasizing that point because it's also a point that we're increasingly, or not increasingly, but it has been continually neglected, and and there's a real need to raise awareness of the importance of the genetic diversity of trees as part of their role in nature-based solutions. So in relation to that, of course, what we need to be able to do is conserve that diversity if we want to be able to use it. And in the context of tree diversity, it's not just conserving the species diversity, but it's conserving the genetic diversity. And within the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAC, we've been championing through regional networks, forest genetic resource programs to conserve genetic diversity within a range of important tree species. But I think it's important to recognize that this conservation now needs to be done in the context of future climate change as well. For example, we've been working with Latin America on important food tree species such as Choromoya, in sub-Saharan Africa, in a wide range of food tree species, particularly in Burkina Faso, and conducting threat analysis on the genetic resources within these. And I just want to share with you a very recent image, which is a map showing hotspots of in situ conservation sites for 65 important, socially ecologically important tree species across Southeast Asia, where we've been working with a project across 13 countries to really convene information on where tree species currently are, but how their distributions will change in the face of climate change, and how we can use that information to not only identify conservation, but improve our decision making on how we use that genetic diversity to address in restoration and in nature-based solutions through restoration interventions. So not only do we need to conserve that diversity, but as I said, fundamental to that is being able to use it, and that means delivering the right tree biodiversity for the right purpose. And this means being able to provide the information to stakeholders to be able to actually access that biodiversity to make it feasible in delivering nature-based solutions. And one of the ways we've been working with stakeholders to do this is developing decision support tools on native tree species selection. This particular tool is called Diversity for Restoration, was originally developed for the dry forest of Colombia, and we're now rolling this out across Latin American countries, Southeast Asia, and African countries. And the purpose of this is to really support the capacity to deliver the use of native tree species for multiple restoration objectives. And so the tool is spatially explicit, and it enables you to input specific objectives in the context of restoration to ensure that you can actually meet multiple objectives using native tree species. But it also includes information on the on the seed sources of those species and predicting future climate change to enable those genetic resources that be the most suitable for your restoration in future conditions. And I think I really wanted to flag this point because I think it's fundamental to the future progression of our use of biodiversity and nature-based solutions, because at the moment there's a huge political commitment to use trees in restoration, but we're not investing adequately in how we deliver the right diversity and ensuring we consider genetic diversity and suitability for climate change. For example, I'm frequently talking with national partners saying we just don't have the time to consider these genetic issues in seed sourcing for restoration. But the reality of this, if we want nature-based solutions to be resilient to future change and to deliver benefits, we can't afford not to consider them. And so we need to be able to have policies in place that can ensure that decisions made using nature-based solutions use adequate proportions of native diversity and genetic considerations. And I think with that, I will end.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's really helpful to have us all reminded that for all that we're talking about deploying nature-based solutions in part to address climate change, we also need to take climate change into account in their design and implementation. That's a really helpful perspective and some very exciting tools there. Can we move on now into the agricultural landscape and ask Rhett Harrison from the World Agroforestry Centre to tell us about measuring biodiversity in agricultural landscapes? How do we know we've done it if we can't measure it?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. And can you see my screen?
Not yet, but it looks like it's coming.
Okay. Is it there yet?
It says you've started screen sharing, but it's not showing us anything. Are you showing us the right screen?
I think so. I mean, I'm seeing the right screen. Can you see it now? Maybe it's...
Try stopping and starting again.
Hi, Rhett. We will share we have your talk, so we'll share it from our computer.
I think my Zoom has frozen. Can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can hear you very well. We'll share your slides. Just tell us when you want them to be changed. Thank you.
All right. So are we on the well, let's go to the background slide.
Okay.
Okay, so when we consider biodiversity in agricultural landscapes, I mean, first of all, we have this situation I think the audience here is very familiar with, that we have a lot of problems. I mean, the Millennium Assessment estimated that 60% of ecosystem services were impaired, and we have at least 20% of agricultural land globally is already degraded. So, and we're also dealing with aspects such as agricultural expansion being a major driver of biodiversity loss. So can I move on this next slide, please? So when we're looking at farmland biodiversity, the benefits of farmland biodiversity are obviously depend on the abundance, diversity, and the distribution of that biodiversity. And compared to natural environments, you have a very high spatial variability in these characteristics, which makes assessment challenging. On the other hand, for improved management, we need fine-grained, easy-to-update information on our social outcomes, our land health, carbon, and the biodiversity. So at ICRAF, we've been trying to develop protocols for improving this kind of information and make it easy for decision makers to assess their biodiversity. So the next slide. So these landscape scale, first of all, obviously we want to understand biodiversity at landscape scales. It's no point in just having a knowledge of biodiversity at very local scales. We want to be able to see how it changes across large spatial scales. So we've developed these protocols where we base them on assessments in particular landscapes that are then replicated over for example, a country at several different sites. They're based on a 25 by 25 kilometer assessment area. And our basic protocols cover things like land cover, trees, and birds. We focus on the trees because we can see those from space. And one of the critical things that we want to be able to do with this these methods is to be able to use remote sensing to update the information cheaply and frequently. We use the birds to get some indication of how the other components of biodiversity may be related to trees. If we go to the next slide. So for landscape protocols, we also have optional protocols for covering topics that may be of interest in particular situations. For example, the pollinators, the natural enemies, and the soil organisms, which are all delivering very important ecosystem services in the agricultural landscapes. What you see here is actually a map of linear tree features. So we developed a protocol for looking at these specifically because we weren't sure whether the general tree plots would be able to survey these accurately. So we developed a protocol specifically looking at these. And these, as you can see in this landscape, they can be very important. These are field boundaries, all with trees running along them. And what do we do with these data? Well, next slide, please. We try and create prediction services based on the remote sensing data. And this is some data that we have from Uganda, where you can see on the left, we've got, based on our trees on farm assessment, we can look at the biomass. And so this is a prediction surface created from the remote sensing data. And as you can see, the R-squareds are quite high. We have 75, an R-squared of 0.75. And for the tree composition, we have similar, quite good prediction capabilities for what tree composition you can see across these landscapes. Next slide. So ultimately, what we want to do is to have some kind of assessment of some property of the trees on farms that we can measure from space. So for example, the above ground biomass, and be able to predict other components of biodiversity from that, so that we can update this information and derive a better understanding of the overall characteristics of the biodiversity at the landscape scale. So here, what I've tried to do is to plot what bird diversity looks like in comparison to the above ground biomass, which we've measured from our trees, and we get a prediction curve. Obviously, this is a work in progress, and one of the things that we want to do, is to start incorporating landscape characteristics. For example, the connectivity to the different points, and the amount of, for example, natural habitat within a certain distance of your points. How important is that, for example, in predicting bird diversity versus the actual condition of the plot that we're measuring? And another dimension that we want to go down is to look at multi-species modeling, so that we can look at how the different species co-occur in these landscapes. There are some very clear problems that have emerged from our understanding of this work. Well, one of them is extinction debt. Extinction debt is the process by which, when a natural habitat is fragmented, the decrease in area leads to a decrease in the number of species that habitat can support. But what occurs is that you get a decrease in area, but the species take some time to relax to their appropriate level of diversity. So there's an extinction debt in many landscapes. And this is very difficult to estimate. We know that landscapes may have more species in them today than they should do, based on the area of natural habitat remaining. And then another very significant problem is the consideration of other drivers of biodiversity loss. And in particular here, we're thinking of things like pesticides and hunting. If you're trying to advocate, for example, for increasing trees on farms for pollination benefits, if there are pesticides, neonicotide pesticides are in widespread use, it isn't going to have a very big effect. And measuring this, obviously, from space is almost impossible. You need some kind of indicator of what is the local pesticide use. And hunting is another very big problem, particularly when we're thinking about the conservation benefits of these landscapes. If species are being hunted as soon as they leave the forest reserves and so forth, then no matter how many trees or how much you repair the habitat outside of those reserves, they won't have much of a function in terms of conservation. As a spin-off to this work, we've been looking at how we could create an indicator for biodiversity, for the conventional biodiversity, which of course is being reconsidered. So if we go to the next slide, So we've been calling this the Farmland Biodiversity Score. And the aim of this, of course, is to have a global scale indicator, something that we can predict across the entire planet, or at least the entire forested area of that would be normally forested area of the planet. And what we've done to develop this is we've looked at, well, biomass is an important indicator of vegetation. So we can generate biomass maps. So that's one component of this score that we're looking at. And then we can also look at just the spectral diversity of the remote sensing signals, which can, at different spatial scales, it indicates different measures of diversity. For example, at a large spatial scale, it may indicate the number of different habitats and crops and so forth within the landscape. At smaller spatial scales, it can correlate to the actual species diversity that you get within a patch. And then we're considering that we want to weigh these scores by their neighborhood, so that, for example, areas with higher biomass would get a higher score if they're surrounded by areas with high biomass, so that you get scoring for increased, for example, fragment size. And then we also want to weigh the scores by some of the ecosystem functions that this biodiversity provides. And we're focusing at the moment on slope and proximity to stream and rivers to provide buffers. So where vegetation, more diverse vegetation occurs next to a river, we might assume that it's providing a better ecosystem function. So we are trying to generate this farmland biodiversity score, and we will be using the data sets that we've compiled through these other surveys to test how well this score does in terms of predicting biodiversity at large spatial scales. And with that, I think I've finished. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rhett. Really useful to hear all of that, and to be thinking about the sort of nested scales and the way we measure and think about biodiversity and the various dimensions that we can actually get at with the different tools available to us. We look forward to pursuing that in discussion. I think next up we have Janice, but Rhett, I'm going to need you to, I think, as per the instructions in your chat, I think log out and log back in because of our earlier technical glitch. Meanwhile, I hope Janice can start sharing her screen to talk to us about the importance of ecological integrity as a key criterion for nature-based solutions. Rhett, can you have a go at logging out and then coming back in to join us?
Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Janice.
Yes, we can, Janice, it's fine.
Okay, right.
Yes, I can, yes.
Good.
Okay, great.
I can't.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this panel. My name's Janice Weatherly Singh and I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society based in Brussels. So in my day-to-day work, I'm most interested in looking at issues like biodiversity and nature-based solutions from the perspective of policymakers. And so looking at the issue of ecological integrity, this is a widely held definition. And I just wanted to point out that it does encompass species composition, so obviously the biodiversity element, but also structure and function of ecosystems. So it's quite a wide concept. And the illustration on the screen shows that ecological integrity is shown to be important for a wide range of different values. And I wanted to point out the first one in particular, resilience, which we heard about earlier. And obviously an ecosystem with high ecological integrity is expected to be more resilient to different types of environmental changes. And the research that WCS has been involved with other partners, which has really started on forests, has shown that forests with a high ecological integrity deliver a disproportionate level of benefits across a range of values, such as biodiversity, but also carbon sequestration, the importance and usefulness to indigenous cultures, and a range of different ecosystem services. And we're now starting to look to see if that's also true for other ecosystems. And preliminary results show that it's a very similar picture for coral reefs and also rangelands. And so we expect it to be similar across a range of different ecosystem types. So looking a bit more closely to the value of biodiversity, so we very much take the perspective that biodiversity conservation needs a full spectrum response. So whereas in conservation, a lot of attention goes to, and understandably goes to the most threatened species, to the areas under highest threat, and that's where your kind of emergency response kicks in, and sort of akin to a healthcare system. That would be your accident and emergency. But we also need to think of it, also needs to consider these high ecological integrity areas. And it's not just about stopping threatened species from becoming extinct, but also keeping other species common, keeping those ecosystems intact and preventing ecosystem degradation. And we think that ecological integrity is, or high ecological integrity is a good predictor for biodiversity, because obviously habitat area fragmentation and habitat quality very much influences the ability of an ecosystem to support a diverse range of species. So the two are very much interconnected. So if you can identify which areas have high ecological integrity, as we've seen for forests and we expect to see for other ecosystems, it really would help you to target your nature-based solution investments to areas which are delivering disproportionate level of benefit for biodiversity, for carbon sequestration, and other types of ecosystem services. And at the very minimum, a key criteria for nature-based solutions should be to ensure that they don't lead to a decrease in ecological integrity, and in that way it can act as a biodiversity safeguard. And obviously what we would want to see is an increase in ecological integrity because of a nature-based solution, which would show that it's delivering biodiversity co-benefits and benefits across a range of ecosystem values. So in terms of relevant policy fora, we think ecological integrity could be a very useful indicator for the CBD post-2020 discussion, which is obviously a hot topic at the moment. But also because of the connection between biodiversity and carbon sequestration in ecosystems or forests with high ecological integrity, it could be a good indicator of achievements under the UNFCCC. Also for measuring progress in achieving restoration targets, for example, under the Bond Challenge. It can also be useful for donors to see how effective their investments are in nature-based solutions. Are they leading to an increase in ecological integrity? And also for NbS practitioners in terms of what would happen under different types of plans, what would the implications of that be for ecological integrity? So we've found in the recent past that indicators have often been restricted to ecosystem extent. So in the case of forests, it's fairly easy to see it has been a change in the extent of forest area between two different points in time. Has your forest increased or decreased? But ecosystem degradation or forest degradation has received much less attention. And we're only really seeing in some recent papers the huge importance of forest degradation, the huge contribution of that, sorry, to greenhouse gas emissions, to carbon emissions, sorry. So not only has ecosystem degradation been ignored and not been given much attention by policymakers or donors, the consequences of it have also not been given much attention either. And it's just really in the last 5 years that there's been big advances in technology, which are making it possible to develop some of these indicators. So we can go beyond looking at the extent of different ecosystem types and areas to really see a bit more in detail what's happening in terms of degradation. And there's been recently advances made in mapping of human pressures which is a very good pressure or a very good proxy for ecosystem degradation. So, for example, some of my colleagues have recently published a global index of terrestrial ecological integrity, and you can see it here at a global level, but it's also available at lower spatial levels. And it just gives a kind of snapshot of which areas have highest ecological integrity for a range of different ecosystem types. And a commitment has been made to update that on an annual basis. And we're now moving into a phase of trying to develop metrics for specific ecosystem types at a finer scale. So the first one has started with a forest landscape integrity index. That's still in review, but has had favourable reviews, so we hope it will be published shortly. And you can already go to the web link and have a look. It's freely available for anyone to make use of. And I think the two maps illustrate it quite nicely. So you can see in the first one, it very clearly shows it's a more traditional map of forest area. And you could obviously, looking back in time, you could see whether that's increased or decreased. But when you look at the integrity data, you get a much more detailed picture of what's actually happening and what's the situation within that forest and the quality of the forest. And you can see which areas are more intact compared to others. And we're now looking at developing similar indicators for other ecosystem types. And I think there was a question somewhere about, is this just all focused on terrestrial ecosystems? And we're now looking at coral reefs, which are obviously hugely important for a wide range of values, and developing ecological integrity index for coral reefs, and also work is underway for a similar type of indicator for rangelands or grasslands as well. So I'll leave it there, but feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks.
Super, thanks, Janice. That's really interesting and very exciting to see that progress. That's something I've been thinking about for years, and it's clearly really critical, particularly as most of us are talking about landscape scale at the moment. Thanks very much. And last but by no means least, can we hear from Manuel Pulgaridal to talk to us about the UNFCCC and the CBD, which takes us back to where I started this conversation.
Thank you very much, Val. And yeah, I am going to switch completely, because I am not going to refer to a technical thing, but to a policy and political thing, that I think it is a good way to finish this first intervention by framing what my colleagues have just mentioned. So let me start by saying, and thank you, Janice, that in one of your last slides, you have made a bridge in between the ecological integrity with CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, NDC, among some others. Because what I will try to say, Val, it is to answer the question, how much nature-based solutions can support biodiversity? And to answer that question, what we do need to have into consideration, it is the big picture. And for me, there are four main elements for the big picture. The first one, it is that when we talk about nature-based solutions, we are talking about an evolving concept. What it is good, because we can continue and we can still working on that concept. The second one, it is that when we think about politically and about the conventions, we do need to recognize the big difference in between the different conventions, climate, biodiversity, desertification, among some others. The third element, it is that there are some current trends. We have trends, and even the pandemic has brought to us some, probably the only single virtue of the pandemic, it is that it has made possible to integrate the agenda. So most of the people is talking now about convergence. How can we link climate with nature and development and the economy and the political decision? What it is good. It is the only single virtue of this pandemic. And the fourth element, it is what are those low-hanging fruits, that means of implementation related to convention or to the domestic process that we can take advantage of as a way to move nature-based solutions as a big and strong support to biodiversity. So let's go to the first one. And it is interesting because Robin, Chris, Red, and Janice, they have mentioned different approaches to conserve biodiversity, and they have talked about maintain diversity, tree biodiversity, genetic diversity, ecosystem services, ecological integrity. So the point it is, which one of those it would be the main criteria and indicator to define the value of that nature intervention. Because when we think about nature-based solutions, Val, what we do need to have it is, or go back to the most basic concept. There are three main values: the value of the nature intervention, the value of the challenge, and the value of the co-benefits. And probably we have developed more the value of the societal challenge. And it is interesting that we have evolved, and now for the community, nature-based solution, it is more than just to address the climate challenge. And now it is clear that it could be to address the water scarcity or water security, the food security, among some others, what it is good. And probably the indicators that the community has developed are more related to that societal challenge. But the point is what it would be the indicator to define the value of the nature intervention. And how can we adopt that kind of indicator to see how much we are really building a value for biodiversity when we think about nature-based solutions. And why this is important, Val and friends? Because this concept of nature-based solutions is getting political traction. And when things as this get that political traction, it should be narrowed quickly. Because let's imagine that parties of COP26 decide to recognize nature-based solutions as a main tool. What is going to happen? That the parties are going to demand more clarity, are going to demand and to understand how it would be measured, this nature-based solution thing. So it is not going to be enough with the standards that IUCN is going to release soon, but probably to define some kind of bodies that can secure and assure the quality of the standards and indicators, and that can test how are we going to measure nature-based solution. And all of this, it is just about the first element, the concept. But let's move to the second one, the convention. It is clear that when we think about climate and biodiversity, there are huge differences. So the Biodiversity Convention, it is the poor cousin of the CBD, and the UNCCD, it is the poorest of the poorest, unfortunately, despite that they started exactly at the same time, the same year in 92. But it is not just about that. The second element, it is about the target. It is clear what is the threshold for the climate. We are talking about 1.5, that is related to carbon. It is easier to measure. But how are we going to measure success and the target of the CBD? And that moves me to the point that, unfortunately, in relation to the CBD, in some way, and I am not used to being a pessimistic, but in some way, we have failed. And we are in a time in which we should define more clearly how to create a target that can change behavior. And that is something that probably we haven't defined yet well. We are still moving around numbers, but we are not creating the correct incentive to change the behavior when we think about biodiversity. It is more difficult because as biologists are used to thinking, there are no way to compare the 1.5 carbon of the climate with some equivalent in the biodiversity. Probably that's true. So the point is, how could we develop that incentive to change the behavior in the CBD? But fortunately, what it is happening, but there is also a second huge difference. When we think about nature-based solutions in the climate community and in the UNFCCC, it is clear what we are expecting. We are expecting nature intervention to address the climate challenges that are more related to mitigation and to adaptation. No? So the point is how much they could contribute, and there are a lot of debate if it is 25%, 30%, 37%. So this is not to be discussed here. But it is clear what is the main objective. The point is, if we are planning to include nature-based solutions into the CBD, it should be completely different. The point is how much nature-based solutions could be a useful tool for the CBD to achieve their own target and their own objective. And what it should be the criteria in the CBD to secure that nature-based solutions are going to create nature benefits. No? And unfortunately, friends, that is not happening in the CBD. The CBD probably is more conservative in relation to the international debate in comparison with the climate. And they are resisting to the concept. What it is weird, it is crazy, because they are still keeping the idea of ecosystem-based approach and not accepting the idea of nature-based solution. So the future could bring to us two conventions with different treatments, different names, and different concepts. And that would be really crazy. That is not what we're expecting to have. we are expecting to converge. We are expecting to bring concept that it could be aligned for both. The third element, it is about the current trend. And fortunately, what it is happening, it is that science has started to align its concept. And fortunately, recently, we saw how much IPCC with a 3 report plus IPBES are trying to coincide, no? So the point in this case, it is IPCC is suggesting the transitions, no, into the climate transition, the energy, urban, industries, land use, among some others. On the other hand, IPBES is talking about the drivers of nature loss, no? And in some way, what I do think it should happen, it is that we should bring the drivers of nature loss as part of the transition. So if we can really make more easier to decision maker to understand all the transitions that can address the climate and the nature challenge, it is going to be easier. Also, we have the pandemic and all this recovery package in which fortunately people and countries are starting to discuss how much by nature interventions we can really promote economic recovery. But there is a challenge for the nature community. It is about economic recovery. So we should demonstrate how economic beneficial it would be our nature intervention to convince the economic decision makers, because the world it is facing a strong economic crisis. And that moves me to the last, and that is why again, thank you, Yanis, because there are some means for implementation. The NDC, it is one of those. Probably you have read what UNDP published in September 2019, I think it was. This 7 pathway to include nature-based solutions into NDCs. It's a strong document. I suggest to you all to read it. No, because it is very pragmatic and it is saying how nature-based solutions should be included into NDCs. But the point is, how can we link NDCs that probably most people knows exactly what does it mean with NbS that nobody knows. If you ask in every country what does it mean NbS, nobody knows. It is interesting the difference not only about the convention but also about the tools. Also how much we can use the non-state actors agenda, the long-term strategy, also what the UK has commissioned to Professor Dasgupta, how to build this narrative in between the economy and nature, and also that the World Economic Forum is close to release its second publication, I think that in some days, next week. So there are many, many ways in which we can develop that narrative, Val, to bring nature-based solutions as a way that can support biodiversity. But the challenge is there, still many tasks and many pending things in which we should strengthen our efforts. Thank you.
Super, and lots of food for thought. Huge amounts of food for thought, and I think about this stuff every day, and you've still stimulated lots of extra thoughts on my part. Right, thank you everyone. There's a lot there, and we've got lots of questions coming in, and I'm trying to think a bit about grouping them. There's actually quite a lot of interest in everything, which is good. Everybody got lots of traction. And there's a lot of interest in this connection between biodiversity and climate resilience. And I think also in particularly some of the concepts around landscape, I'm trying to remember the language, sorry, self-organization, that's the word I was looking for. So here we come, Robin, you first, since you talked first and you've had a longer to be quiet. We have questions about self-organization and to some degree what you mean by that and whether there are risks associated with it. For example, spread of invasives, development of novel ecosystems. So if you could speak a bit to that, and then maybe that can lead us into some resilience questions as well.
Yes, indeed. So let me clarify what I mean by self-organization is basically stepping back as much as possible and allowing colonization and sorting out of species to happen sort of on its own. Now, this is great if there aren't any invasive species that are really taking over in that area, and they could very well impede this process. So there definitely are examples where natural regeneration is strongly suppressed by invasive species. And obviously in that situation, you're just gonna have a monoculture of invasive species instead of a native community, because many of these species are exotic to the ecosystem. So that's a situation where there must be some kind of control of those species if there's going to be any potential for native self-organization. There are some really good examples where this is certain management has been done to assist natural regeneration. I know of several really good cases in Australia. And there are also other cases where some of the invasive species are not, they don't really suppress succession. And once succession becomes underway, those species kind of tend to drop out. This is what we found in Puerto Rico, for example. So I think it is a case-by-case type of situation, and there's no universal response to this, but there are many ways in which we can assist natural regeneration by managing invasive species.
Super, thanks. And then thinking about, thinking about connecting that to some of the climate resilience conversations we heard from Chris, for example. And I'm wondering, this is potentially for any of you, but let me ask this to Chris, and this is a sort of synthesis of some things I've seen on the Q&A feed and a little bit from me too, which is linking this sort of landscape self-organization idea, including ecological integrity, with your thinking about species suitedness and genetic diversity. And I'm kind of wondering, everybody's acknowledged the dimensions of biodiversity and in different combinations, but thinking about the link between those. I wonder if you could get into that a bit.
Sure. I think it's a really good question. And I think one of the challenges is really understanding the scales over which some of these processes can be left to unfold naturally when you want specific objectives from your landscape. So one of the examples I would give is we've done a lot of work in the Western Ghats in India, where we've looked at natural seed dispersal across fragmented landscapes, where you've got a very high value timber species that are in very low densities and very, very rare now. And so the seed production to allow those to expand back into areas where they no longer exist because of overharvesting is very unlikely to occur in any kind of meaningful time frame. And there are also areas where they're very fragmented, and so genetic diversity is compromised. And so there's a need, as Robin articulated a bit, to understand where you can rely on nature to deliver benefits, or depending on what are your objectives as well. So that's a case of timber value, but also high carbon density. And another example from that would be the predominant tree family of Southeast Asia in lowland forest is the dipterocarps. And the dipterocarps are very unlikely to disperse over long distances. So if you have, and this can help answer a little bit, coming into one of the other questions, if you have areas that are completely denuded, but you want natural lowland forest to come back in again, this is not going to happen without some sort of intervention naturally, because the seed supply system and the delivery is just not there by nature. And so the nature-based solutions of natural regeneration are going to need some enrichment planting or underplanting of the natural restoration. And there again is one of the critical points where we need to take genetic diversity into account, because we need to be making sure we're collecting the most genetically diverse seed sources to make sure that enrichment planting is going to be both adaptable to future climate and productive, because the genetic diversity also underlines the productivity of these systems as well. I can go on if you want, but
Robin, did I see you waving a hand in response to that or not? No. Okay. Thank you. That was getting at very much some of the things I was hoping would come up. And in relation to that sort of that whole sort of landscape scale and thinking about the integrity piece, Janice, we had a really interesting question for you about whether there are circumstances in which ecological integrity as a concept or as a metric doesn't work so well to tell us what we need to know about biodiversity. People are asking, you said that you're beginning to have evidence that it works quite well across systems other than forest, but do we know of any examples of things where it doesn't work?
Yeah, I think, so a couple of the questions also asked about the urban environment, and because we were really trying to develop an indicator at a global scale, obviously we're drawing on global data sets, and then when you come to look at a very fine scale or a smaller scale area, it doesn't necessarily work so well. For example, if you had a small area within an urban environment which you'd made interventions to improve the biodiversity, that wouldn't really be picked up on our indicator, so you wouldn't see that corresponding increase. So, and I think yeah, so we've managed to do it to create this index for forests, but there is obviously quite a lot of forest data out there that we can draw on. I think for some of the other ecosystems, it depends a bit on what kind of data is available. So we're now looking at rangelands, and there's various information out there, and it shows that, for example, like soil carbon is very significant within rangeland environments, but obviously you don't necessarily have the widespread data availability out there where you can draw on. So I have to admit, I'm not in the teams working on those in a detailed way, so I can't give a very comprehensive answer. I know that it's very different, for example, in how you design a combined index for a marine environment as compared to a terrestrial one. And my colleagues who are experts in that area are doing a great job in looking at it for coral reefs, for example. But yeah, I think basically for I can just say that for coral reefs and rangelands, it's under development, and I think it's progressing very well. But for other ecosystems, we just haven't started looking at it yet. Maybe others have, but I couldn't really comment because I don't know. Yeah, we haven't tried to do that work. So sorry, that was maybe didn't answer the question as fully as you'd like.
It got us part of the way. It stimulated a lot of questions from me personally, but I'm not supposed to do that. So Rhett's been waving at me. Let's hear from Rhett.
Yeah, I think that ecological integrity works very well when the desired community is or the desired endpoint is some kind of conservation of a natural habitat that's functioning entirely naturally. As soon as you put management in there, then you deviate in terms of the objectives that you're trying to get from that area of land, whether that be, for example, timber production in a forest, or in the case of, obviously, agricultural landscape is highly it's highly altered, and so it's not going to score very highly, but it may be producing very valuable services from biodiversity for people. And so we do want to understand, just because a forest, for example, isn't a really nice piece of conservation habitat, doesn't necessarily mean it isn't providing services for people. So there is I think it's a really valuable indicator, but at the same time, it has to be, we have to consider where it's appropriate to use it and where maybe it's not so appropriate.
Right, so we're talking about indicators, and I could go on about integrity, and actually I really liked Robin's point about caring for fragments as nuclei of recolonization and self-organization, and those bits don't contribute anything at all to your integrity index if you're not careful. But I actually wanted to pick up on this indicator idea and come back to Manuel and ask whether there's space. I mean, you flagged the idea of essentially certifying NbS. You very carefully didn't say that. I know you didn't say that, but you flagged quality assurance and application of the standards. So forget I said the C word, and let's just think about QA and sort of indicators of quality. And I'm wondering whether that sort of indicator idea might be, whether you think that's an avenue which might bring some more convergence between the conventions, or whether it's actually going to bring more divergence. And I think you and I can probably imagine both directions happening.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult question, but there are some temptations. When we are talking about a new concept, one of the first temptations, mostly in developing countries, it is, okay, we should regulate this concept, no? And now you have some people thinking that probably what we should do it is to define in some law what does it mean nature-based solutions and those kind of things. What I am not in favor of, no? So I am not in favor to regulate. But probably a good example of what it could be the evolution of this concept nature-based solution, it is with the green bonds. It is really interesting, and I am going to show to you how much that concept and what it is happening with the green bonds, it could be applied. If we think in the green bonds, it is a main concept. But the idea when we think about green bonds, sovereign green bonds, it is to avoid to have those kind of mechanisms as a way to greenwash. No, that is a principle that everybody is used to raising. So for example, what it is happening in the EU, they have developed not only the concept, but also a taxonomy. And the taxonomy is becoming a good mechanism to see, what kind of investment it could be defined as green investment in relation to the green bonds. In some countries, as France, and I am the chairman of the Evaluation Council of the Green Bond, we are in charge of evaluating randomly some of the investment if they are fulfilling with not only the European taxonomy, but with an internal taxonomy or kind of internal taxonomy, to see and to say to the investor, look, this is working well because investment has demonstrated that it is a climate one or a biodiversity one. So what I think is going to happen, it is not, and fully agree with you, and that is why I didn't mention certification. We don't need to certificate, but we do need to create mechanisms that can secure the quality, that can send good political signal. Mostly, as I mentioned in my intervention, when this is going to be a political mechanism recognized in some of the conventions. So if we know what is going to happen with the NDCs and how much we are moving the NDCs into being accountable, the point it is how can we make nature-based solutions an accountable mechanism? What are those kind of elements? I don't have all the answers, and that is why what it is positive, it is that we are in an evolving concept. And as we are in the middle of that process, we can contribute, we can brainstorm to think what it would be and what it could be the best way to do that. But that what we do need to secure quality, I am fully sure. Because, Val, what it is happening now, nature-based solutions, it is in many cases everything and nothing at the same time, unfortunately. So that is the point with the concept. We should secure that this concept is not only going to get traction, but also quality. That's my main point.
Super, and we've had a couple of questions about where the problems with traction in the CBD are, and also a really interesting question about whether somebody made a mistake in 1992 in separating the three conventions.
Yeah, I don't think so. I read it. I don't think so. I think that processes are used to taking their own pathway, And in 92, when we brought from Stockholm to Rio a united environmental agenda, but in Rio we split it and fragmented naturally, because what we probably thought it is that it would be better to do that way, to have all those of the topics getting their own traction, And that happened in some way with climate more than with biodiversity, and for sure more than the desertification one. But now we are exactly in the opposite process. And I am sure, Val, I don't know why, that 2022, in which we are going to celebrate the 50th year of the Stockholm Summit, is going to be the time to reaffirm that convergence. So now we are in the time in which we are walking the opposite pathway, the pathway to link the convention and to try to define better ways to implement it. Because I am used to thinking, Val, it's very difficult for developing countries to have different agendas with different tools, with different mandates at the same time, because sometimes there are a lack of resources, to implement it. So as much as we can create that convergence, it's going to be also more easy to implement their mandates.
Great. And will we ever convince the CBD? Don't go there. But I think that's a really useful perspective. I wanted to come back to some of the climate resilience ideas for a minute. There was a really interesting question very early in the flow around whether some of the pathways that deliver ecological resilience in the ways that Robin and Chris were talking, how closely related are they to the pathways that deliver social ecological resilience? In other words, if we're talking about NbS as something that helps to increase the resilience of society, do those same properties that we think, as many of us ecologists, deliver ecological resilience, are they also helping with that social ecological resilience? I'm going to let you fight over that, but maybe start with Chris.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, it's a hard question to start with. It's a good question, and I think a really important question. But I mean, my view is that really that you can't disentangle a social ecological system from an, you know, it's all part of the same thing, and so the resilience of that system is dependent on the constituent parts. And to me, biodiversity is the foundation of that resilience, and so. A landscape's capacity to resist shock, whether that be through market crashes or political events, is equally resilient through its diversity than you know, trying to engineer that resilience in some other social institutional way. In my view, it's a hard question, but it's a bit philosophical as well. Robin, maybe you want to.
I agree. It is, in my concept of the landscape resilience, as I presented it, it's very much a socio-ecological system. But interestingly, the metrics that we've been using for sort of what qualifies as resilient are much stronger on sort of the natural sciences side of things. And we really do, I think it's time to explore what other indicators or variables we need to start looking at and monitoring and working towards that are really telling us more about the social end of that spectrum. But they're all linked, and it's hard to find indicators that really do link the social and ecological progression and show those feedbacks very clearly.
Interesting. I was just thinking about Reton and the agricultural landscapes. Yes, okay, now he's waved, so I don't have to put him on the spot.
Yeah, okay, I was wondering whether I should intervene. But I mean, I think it does depend very much on the type of use of that landscape that we're seeing. But for example, in a system where we might have a large number of poor smallholder farmers, such as in Africa or many parts of Southeast Asia and other tropical countries, then obviously the biodiversity, the resilience that we get from the landscape resilience and the socio-ecological resilience are very closely aligned, because those farmers depend on, you know, for example, water supply, and they depend on they need to, if they are exposed to drought, they need to be able to harvest forest resources or have alternatives that they can, assets, for example, timber that they can harvest and sell. But I think there is, and particularly this COVID has exposed this with our whole food systems and the way that many of our our production systems are based on a kind of industrial model where you have large areas of monoculture, high capital input through mechanization and industrial fertilizers, pesticides, and so forth. And obviously, in those kinds of systems, the resilience comes from having money in the bank or wherever. But we are seeing with COVID a breakdown of the resilience of these systems, where people can't get foods moved around the world because transport and travel has been hampered. So it's a complicated problem, but I think that we are beginning to learn that these very industrialized systems are not necessarily as resilient as we thought they were.
Super. I have a feeling that Zoom is about to tell us we're supposed to take a break, but I'd quite like just to try to pull this together and see whether anybody has any last thing they want to say. It seems to me that one of the set questions I started out with which is, do we think that biodiversity benefits are or should be a fundamental property of nature-based solutions? Everybody, obviously, in this panel seems to think the biodiversity benefits are incredibly important and very closely linked to the effectiveness of ecosystem management in delivering societal benefits in relation to societal challenges. So is it just a question of degree? Is it a question of the value of a nature-based solution being about the balance between those benefits? And is there any biodiversity benefit that is too small for us to be happy with? 15 seconds each, unless it throws us out. Maybe Janice, I'll start with you actually, because you were talking about big systems and the benefits and importance of big systems. Can we have too little integrity for it to be worth mentioning?
Oh gosh, I can't answer that in a few seconds, but yeah, I think we just, I mean, I guess where we started from was that these big, still intact systems are actually under pressure, but it's more from degradation. So it's, death by 1,000 cuts as opposed to an obvious loss, which is much more dramatic and gets attention. And then I guess the other point we were trying to show is that in these big remaining, you could call them wilderness areas if you liked, you've got this overlap and benefit for biodiversity and climate, but also for indigenous peoples and other benefits as well for people. So, and they're just not being really picked up in any fora because the attention tends to go to those places that are under greatest threat. So that was what we really set out to highlight. And then obviously it can be used in other ways as well. I don't think I answered your question, but that's my perspective.
But you summed up really nicely, and I guess I'm asking about those sort of incremental values of adding biodiversity to the picture. Robin, can we come to you next? I'm going in Zoom window order.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about the fact that the origins of agriculture were with people chewing on foods and throwing the seeds out of the window or out of on a pile outside their home, and that a lot of the things that have worked in nature were not things that we initially necessarily planned. There were things we learned about and things we took advantage of, and I think that you can't always know in advance what's going to end up being important or what's going to save people or save various species. And I do think we need to think very carefully about assigning value only to certain charismatic species or only to a number of species, because I really think that we may overlook really, really important things that we don't yet know are going to matter in the future.
Super, thank you. That sounds like a good thing to open up for Rhett, yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, working in agricultural landscapes, I think, 2 species is better than 1 and 4 species is better than 2 and so on. But I also think that we tend to focus on the habitat interventions, the restoration of the trees in the landscape, or the agroforestry, increasing trees on farms, and the diversity of trees on farms. And we forget that, at least in terms of biodiversity benefits, we do need to think about other interventions, like, for example, preventing hunting, or at least making hunting sustainable. Otherwise, we won't realize the benefits for biodiversity and other components. And of course, pesticides is a big, big issue if you're talking about the agricultural landscape in that context as well. You won't realize the benefits for pollination. You won't realize the benefits for pest control if you're pouring chemicals or poisons onto your environment. Yeah.
Really good, strong points. Chris, you're next on my screen. Have you got any final words for us?
I'm not sure. I think Rhett hit the nail on the head really nicely with the point on pesticides and pollination. Maybe just to add a little bit to that about this idea of integrity and about when something's no longer valuable. I think it's incredibly difficult to make those judgments. If we think of, for example, tree genetic diversity and the need for pollination to be what drives largely that genetic diversity. You know, a connected landscape is very different from a tree's perspective than it is from another organism. So we need to be able to think from those organismal perspectives, which are not all the same as well. And so understanding how those landscapes are connected is really important in making those kind of judgments about what's valuable or not. And it's very hard to to say something's not valuable in a landscape because it's only a small patch, when actually it's connected to a much broader set of components.
Super, thanks, Chris. And finally, Manuel, can we have one more word on convergence and how we're going to bring all this together?
Yes, 20 seconds. And probably by asking also an additional question, why many actors are embracing the concept of nature-based solutions, and also answering a question that it is in the chat. Why should we change from ecosystem-based approach by 3 decades of discussion to this opportunistic nature-based solution? In my point of view, it is because we are switching the paradigm. Nature-based solutions, it is bringing a proactive approach. For me, that is clear. And please, probably this is going to sound tough, but I think that in some way we are moving from defensive conservation into proactive actions. So that is why different actors are embracing the concept, because it's looking the huge opportunities that it is emerging by defining actions in nature that can create co-benefits. I think it is a switching of paradigm. It's going to take time, but that is my feeling.
Thank you. Thank you for all those really useful insights. We're being encouraged to wrap up and go have our break before the poster session starts. Nat?
Thank you very much. What a wonderful, compelling session. Great. We're now going to have a very short break before the second of our poster sessions. Thank you very much, everyone.